Series. Today is my great pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Jim Jirsa, Chair Emeritus from UT Austin. Just to show you who Professor Jirsa is, let me just tell you, for those of you trying to complete your PhDs, he completed his PhD at Urbana in 3 years. He's gotten too many awards and honors for me to remember. I wanted to put this one here in writing because it tells you who he is. This was awarded to him by the American Concrete Institute in recognition of his creative career as a teacher, researcher, and author. And he indeed is a great teacher. He has over 40 years of experience teaching. As a researcher, the first thing that comes to my mind is that every time I look up anything that has to do with repair of reinforced concrete, the paper I'm reading one way or another was either written by him or leads me to a paper written by him. He's a member of the National Academy of Engineering, former president of the American Concrete Institute. And to end my introduction, let me give you a couple of sentences written by our own Professor Sosen in an essay that he called Young Jirsa's Yen, a title that I still don't quite understand. Talking about Professor Jirsa's work with slabs, he said that he, Dr. Jirsa, devised a simple table for including the effect of pattern loading on positive moment. This table made its way into the 1971 version of the ACI 318 code, and for most people today, that would have been an achievement. Yet, that wasn't exactly the plan. When the ratio of live load to dead load was reduced to 2 in 1995, the table was dropped. And many would have thought, oh, what a disappointment. No, apparently, that was the plan. Dr. Jirsa is the rare type of researcher who is happier when the code is simpler instead of more complicated. Dr. Jirsa, thank you for visiting us today.
Thank you, Santiago, for those kind comments. Young Jirsa's yin, I think that was Meta's way of reminding people that the J is pronounced a Y. So it all fit together. I'm very happy to be here to participate in this series. I think it's a very fitting way of recognizing Dr. Sosen's contributions to teaching and a great deal more than that. All of those of us who had the privilege of working with him know our lives have been different because of that experience. I won't tell you how they're different, but he had an impact on all of us. So I thought about what could I talk about? I've never had any courses in education. I just sort of fell into it. And so I decided that maybe what you were looking for is somebody from, quote, the old school of engineering to talk about the way we used to do things, or maybe just how did I get into engineering education. So, I thought about what might be a good topic, and there's teaching is already in the title. The title is really of this series is the art of teaching engineering art. I'm not sure you're supposed to read it that way, but that's what it says. So engineering is an art and teaching is an art, and maybe that's what it is. So as I was thinking about it, I said, well, maybe thinking is part of what engineering education is. And so I guess if I had a theme for this, it was the part about the thinking. So often, if I don't know exactly what the words mean, and I think I know, so I go to the dictionary. And here's teaching and training. Well, I looked at teaching, and it's nice to know that teaching is the practice of a teacher. That's very helpful, especially when it says especially one whose occupation is to instruct. Well, I guess I should look up instruct as well, but look at training. The education, instruction, or discipline of a person or thing that is being trained. So a thing, I suppose, could be a dog or a machine. And art is skill acquired by experience, study, or observation. That part I have to agree with. That does sum up part of the title. So I looked up the nouns, or the verbs, and it says, well, teaching is to impart knowledge. And train is to make proficient. Well, we do both of those things. We do impart our knowledge. That's one of the things we're charged to do, is to teach future generations what we've learned and try to pass on our knowledge and our skill to the next round. And training is to make proficient. I think that's probably less important, but we do a lot of training. In the laboratory, you're trained how to use the equipment. That's not quite the same as teaching. It's a little bit different process. And you become proficient at it by instruction and practice. But I looked up one more thing. Thinking. Think. To employ one's mind rationally and objectively in evaluating or dealing with a given situation. To me, I think if there's something that I consider a success in teaching, it's asking people to think and to apply their minds to solving problems. It sounds simple, but it's really, it's not that easy, and sometimes you become quite frustrated. This noon we were talking about how many people, Santiago asked the question, how many graduating seniors could solve this problem? I said, well, maybe 70%. A very simple statics problem. And I know from experience that they've looked at it, and if it's a concrete design class and it involves analysis, they want to think about analysis. They're there to learn concrete design. Why do they need analysis? So, the idea of putting different ideas together to come up with a solution, I think, is really what engineering is about. And most of us become engineers because we like that. If we wanted to have absolutes, we'd become scientists or something else. But engineers have to deal with inadequate, insufficient information. And you can't tell the person who's hired you, hey, I don't know enough about this to give you a solution. So you do have to put all your skills together, your knowledge together, and employ your mind to come up with a solution. So what molds a career in engineering teaching? So much of this is going to be my own personal experience, and perhaps it will fit with some of the things that you already know or you're thinking about. I'm going to spend a little bit of time with this, universities with a mission. And we all talk about role models. Obviously, role models, very important. I'll talk about it. Some role models in my career. Mentors, role models and mentors are two different things. And probably for most of us, the mentors we had are the ones that really made an impact on our careers. Colleagues. I think colleagues are very important, and one of the things that I regret most is that the way universities are organized today, there's not as much collegiality as there used to be. We used to get together and talk over lunch. We used to get together and ask each other, what are you doing in the class? Now, a young faculty member feels that that's an admission of not knowing something if they go to a senior faculty member and ask him for advice. That's crazy. It shouldn't be that way, but we're kept so busy doing all the things that the university requires for tenure that we sometimes forget that there's collegiality involved. So, as far as universities with a mission, I'd like to just take a few minutes to talk about the Morrill Act. And I thought about that because at the University of Nebraska, where I did my undergraduate work, there was a Morrill Hall. And I never really knew why there was a Morrill Hall. I'm sure there was a plaque someplace that told about it. But it's because of the Morrill Act. It was first proposed in 1857, passed, but President Buchanan vetoed it. And in 1861, Morrill resubmitted the act, And it was signed into law by President Lincoln July 1862. I think most people don't understand what an important thing that was for engineering education in the United States. The Morrill Land Grant Act created land grant colleges using the proceeds of federal land sales. So the government set up the sale of these federal lands, give to the states to form these land grant schools. And a couple of people were involved with that. The history is sort of interesting. A man named Turner, Jonathan Baldwin Turner. He was basically a farmer from Jacksonville, Illinois. And he was convinced that we needed some sort of new universities. And I'll let you read that, but the main thing is there's a couple of words in there that you need to look at. All practical pursuits and professions in a practical direction. We're talking about engineers. He wanted to develop professions in agriculture and the mechanic arts. Put engineering in there. In the law it says mechanic arts, but that's engineering. So that these people, the workers that are in these areas, in agriculture and in doing hard labor and so on in industry, so that they could develop professions just like the divines. I'm not sure who the divines were, but they're someplace up here. Lawyers, physicians, and military men who have their specific schools, libraries, and apparatus. So he thought there should be a way for people to get an education profession in other than these areas. In 1854, the state of Illinois petitioned Congress for this, and he called for a system of industrial universities cooperative with each other for the more liberal and practical education of our industrial classes. So here you can see we're now getting serious about engineering. That was finally taken up in Congress by Justin Smith Morrill, who was from Vermont. He was elected to Congress and he introduced a resolution to establish one or more schools, agricultural schools, modeled after naval and military schools. And he was primarily interested in agriculture. He presented this bill to Congress. It did not pass the first time around in that form, but it came back with a much more defined purpose to teach agriculture and the mechanic arts, to include scientific and classical studies and military tactics. As Robert Frost and I were walking across campus today, there was a man in his, I guess, naval uniform, ROTC. That was part of the plan, that these people should get some sort of military education. To promote liberal and practical education in the industrial classes of the industrial class, in the pursuits and professions in life. So he was also it was also very much, you didn't do all this to the exclusion of your other, of knowledge in other things than in the engineering or agriculture, but to prepare you for a professional life. And they gave the states the right to organize as seemed to best fit them. So to give you a little bit of an idea, before the Civil War, most engineers were educated at West Point. The military needed engineers. After the Civil War, the German university model began to replace the English college, and the Morrill Act really was responsible for defining what engineering was. The Morrill Act specifically did not permit buildings. They could not build things, but they could develop textbooks and laboratories and so on. That was permitted. So about the time this passed, in 1866, there were only 300 American men. You notice it's men because women were never thought of as engineers. And they had engineering degrees from basically 6 colleges. By 1911, this would be about 40 years after the bill was passed, there were about 3,000 engineers a year, and there were 38,000 degreed engineers. So, I think we can say that the Morrill Act coincided with establishing engineering as a field in American universities. If you're interested in this history, and it is really quite interesting to read about how it came about, the Bent, a magazine from Tau Beta Pi. There's a spring 2009 issue which has a lot of information in it that gives you more about the background of the Morrill Act and its influence. So here is a map of the United States showing the land-grant schools. And there's a lot of others there because there were some additional similar things done for Indian schools, Eskimo schools, and things like that. So this is all on there. But I put this up because of three things. First, the University of Nebraska, where I did my undergraduate work. Then University of Illinois, where I went to graduate school. And Purdue, where we are today. All had their founding, their basis, as part of the Morrill Act and the land-grant schools. You have a very special thing here. You have at the library, I'm not sure what HSSE library is, but there's a mural in there which depicts the contribution of land-grant colleges to American higher education. And it's really a very interesting mural because the first one shows knowledge calling people to take part in getting an education, and this is what Morrill and Turner were interested in doing. The second one shows Lincoln signing the proclamation. The third one shows what's happening. If you look, you can see that there's a bunch of people here. This is energy work, and then there's a number of other things showing people applying what they've learned in the fields. And so the Morrill Act is now beginning to train people. Here you can see that next one. This was the mechanic arts part of it, or the professional side. The middle one is supposed to show you the benefits of having a well-rounded education, that you needed to know things other than just the professional things. And finally, the last one shows what will happen with this whole program. It shows this ship being loaded with all the fruits of this program, and the ship is called Abundance. So it's a very romantic, but it's a very interesting set of murals. So I think it's safe to say that the Morrill Act really established the U.S. as a center of excellence in engineering education, in the training of engineers. Not that I think U.S. News and World Report is the only way to judge these things, but 60 of the 1,000 schools that are reviewed by U.S. News are land-grant schools. Half of the top 50 engineering schools were created by the Morrill Act. 60% of the PhD degrees come from the top 50 schools, granted by the top 50 schools, are from land-grant institutions. So you can see how important these schools are to the PhD degree. Their quality and size really magnify their input, and only 6 of the land-grant schools are not ranked among the top 500 universities in the world. So it's very impressive, a very impressive outcome for that program. 95% of our population has local access to world-class learning opportunities. I put this in red because in my own experience, having the chance to go to the University of Nebraska is something that probably would never have happened had there not been a land-grant school. Coming from an agricultural, a farming background, going to a small school, it was a big deal to go to Lincoln and to go to this big university. And it was very close. I have a feeling that my parents would never have thought it was such a great idea if I said I was going to go someplace far away. But there was a school. Why did I have to go anywhere else? Because I had this opportunity nearby. And this is true throughout the country. There's one thing that I really am concerned about in the U.S. higher education system is that these kinds of opportunities are somehow not being met. And when education at even the public universities, quote, the state-supported universities, is paying maybe 15% or less of the cost of the university, and tuition is now thousands of dollars, it's ruling out so many people. I doubt had I been entering now, I might have not even gone into engineering because it would have been seen as just too expensive to consider. So the University of Nebraska started in 1869. The statehood was 1867, so it was a state shortly after the Morrill Act passed. The land grant was 130,000 acres. You'll see in a minute how that was different for different schools. When I graduated in 1960, the enrollment was about 6,000 students. I think now it's someplace up over 25 to 30. The University of Illinois, founded in 1867 with a land grant of 480,000 acres. The more populous states got more land. So it was sort of the money was, the appropriation was to provide more funding to the people, where the more people were. And I did not know this before I started putting this together, that the University of Illinois was once called the Illinois Industrial University. And Gregory was asked to make it a West Point of the working world. Here was a West Point, still up there as the model. I put this in because I think the Engineering Experiment Station, how many of you have gone back to some of the early bulletins in your research efforts that have come from the University of Illinois Experiment Station? It was a huge, influential source of knowledge, especially what I know is about concrete. The large tests on columns were done there, landmark tests that are still used. A lot of work on concrete properties was done there. And so I think that this was one way of maybe putting some perspective into what was the mission of the university was to teach, and the Engineering Experiment Station was more of a research operation. So there was still a lot of emphasis on teaching. And certainly when I was there was a lot of research, but the faculty at Illinois was a truly outstanding faculty. So, enough for background. You can see I'm a great fan of the Morrill Act because of the opportunities I was given. But let me go through some of the other things that I think mold a career in engineering education. Parents and family. Certainly parents have some impact, although as a parent, when you talk to your children, they don't want to admit that you have any impact on them. And we find that a lot of our freshmen are coming because their father or uncle or mother or somebody was a civil engineer. So that influence is certainly there. Elementary and secondary school teachers. Role models. I had a high school geometry teacher, algebra teacher, who was a coach and taught the mathematics courses, but he loved teaching them, and he made them fun. And he was very encouraging. He said, you need to be an engineer because you're good at math. And what I remember most is that every Friday, there was a Friday night high school football game with another team, and he would give us an algebra problem that we had to solve to figure out which team he was favoring. So you had Crete High School versus Seward High School, and you put in the two variables, Crete and Seward, and you solved the equation, and you found out who he thought was going to win, what the score was going to be. Well, that was fun. So I realized that, learning has to have some fun in it. That there's got to be something that makes you like it and go on. Undergraduate faculty, the person who influenced me most there was another structural engineering teacher. He studied with Hardy Cross at Yale. He was a World War II vet. He got his master's. He did not have a PhD. He got a master's degree. At one time, you could teach engineering without having a PhD. Can you imagine that? So he was very encouraging. And when I was getting ready to graduate, I was thinking that I really wanted a career where I could be out in the open. I was thinking I wanted to be outside, I wanted to do something where I could see what was happening. And I applied to a number of places. One place was, I thought, well, the Park Service would be good. I could be out in these great national parks and so on. Well, nobody wanted me at that time. So it must have been in my last semester there, I went to see this advisor, and I said, I don't think I'm going to get a job. I think I better go to graduate school. I said, where should I go? He said, well, go to the University of Illinois. And he said, if you don't get that, apply also to Michigan State and Wisconsin and so on. So I applied, and I got admitted to Illinois, and so I accepted the offer and went to graduate school. And the graduate school, probably some of the most exciting times of my life. The people who were there, very stimulating. The faculty, it was wonderful. I didn't know all that before I got there, but I was offered an assistantship. So some of you may know the name Bill Hall. I met with Bill Hall, and he said, well, are you interested in steel or concrete? So I don't care. I like them both. He said, good. You'll work with Metasosan. So that's how I got to start working with Metasosan. I was assigned, since I didn't have a strong feeling, and I often think about that, I might have been a steel guy. Think of that. I don't know whether I would have had the same kind of career or not, but there are some of these things that sort of influence your career, and when you think back, you don't know quite what happened. So, last one is colleagues. And once again, I'd like to emphasize that one of the things that bothers me the most is the lack of collegiality. I've spent time in New Zealand as a visitor there, teaching for one semester. Every afternoon at Canterbury University in Christchurch, all the faculty get together for tea. You have a chance to talk, and they're saying, oh, you need to know how so-and-so is doing in the class. You talk about that. But it was a chance to get together. I also spent some time in Turkey at Middle East Technical University, and there they have an afternoon, I think it's afternoon tea. And they get together, and if there's a big occasion, they bring in some baklava, and it's a special occasion because somebody's got a new car or bought a house or something. But those things create an atmosphere that I hope some of you will think about that. One of the things that putting this together, I remembered is that while I was chair of the department at the University of Texas, every year in the summer we had a summer sort of a strategic planning session. And every year they would come back and said, you know, it's your fault we don't get together because we don't have any place to get together. So after a couple of years hearing this, I said, okay, we're going to fix that. So we found a room that was available in the morning, like at 10 o'clock. And we send out a message to the faculty, you wanted a room to meet, we're starting next week, and it'll be up on the 10th floor of our building. So went to the first one, and it turns out that the person who was in charge of undergraduate admissions for the college and did a lot of the counseling for the college was a civil engineer. He and I were the only ones there, but his office was almost on that floor. And so we did this for about 3 or 4 weeks. I guess we did it once. We tried to do it. We started with once a month. We did it for a semester, and we were only the ones that ever came. And so I told him the next year, I said, you know, we've done this, but nobody comes. Oh, well, it's not at the right time. Well, we all have classes. I don't think the whole faculty had class at 10 o'clock, but that's okay. So we abandoned it. And I think part of that is that you begin to feel guilty if you take time away from sitting at your desk doing something, quote, productive. And going for tea is not productive. So you lose one of those things that binds you as a community. Mentors. I have been fortunate to have some very good mentors. And when I think of the definition of mentor, I could put mentor, meta, and it would mean the same thing. Mentor has been a wise and trusted counselor or teacher and a lifelong friend. And he's been an influential senior sponsor or supporter. How many people do you know that don't get support from someone they've worked with? because, well, maybe they're going to outclass me, and that we don't want to have that. Or maybe, I have no, maybe it takes too much time. But success is based on helping someone that's coming up to have their own success. And maybe if there's one thing I hope you remember from this, is that don't forget to help people who are coming along in the profession and need a little push and a little pull to get to the next level. Colleagues, professional colleagues, these are people that you will be interacting with in technical things. I once had a graduate come in to talk to my senior design class about a job that was going on. But she started with a very took them all by surprise, because she said, one of the most important things you need to remember is that structural engineering is a very small field. And you can't do much without somebody else finding out about it. So she said, if in that class that you're taking, you start cheating or you start copying somebody else's work, don't think they're going to forget that. In 10 years from now, when you're dealing with that person out in the field, they're going to remember that you did something that they weren't necessarily very happy with. It made a great impression on them because they weren't expecting that. I wasn't expecting it. But I think she was absolutely right. We're too small a field to think that you can hide. It just won't happen. Academic colleagues, I've already talked about that. In my own experience at the University of Texas, where I've spent most of my academic career, when I first came there, we used to get together for lunch. We used to talk about it. We used to ask each other, what are you covering in the course? How did this exam work? What kind of a question did you come up with? And this was fairly routine. Over the years, as I said, that's disappeared. We don't get very much of that. And I think it's too bad, because I think that the only way to learn is by other people's experiences, and you can get a lot out of that. Students, I look at the students that I interacted with as a student myself, and students that have been in my classes or on my research project. And those students, especially that have worked with me on research, many of them become lifelong friends and have had influence on what I've done. So all of those different contacts have some impact on your career, and sometimes you don't really realize it until much later. So let me go back to the goal of education: teaching, training, or thinking. In short, impart knowledge, make proficient, employ one's mind. As I started adding this think to the list here, I was reminded of a colleague that came to our faculty from another university, another land-grant school, who had retired there and came sort of a second career. And one day we were getting a lecture from our leadership that we needed to put up on our doors our whole schedule so people could see where we were and what we were doing. So, if you were going to be out at the laboratory doing research, you had to put that in there. If you had class, put that in. When were office hours? And he raised his hand and he said, would it be acceptable if I wrote in thinking? Yeah. And people sort of laughed. Think about that. Spending some time thinking. What a concept. So I hope you do some thinking, because to me that's one of the most important things you can do. So some views of education. Galileo, can only help him find it within. So I think that makes a great case for thinking. Another one is here, Anatole France. And I won't try to repeat it. And the last one is probably controversial on this campus. So I hope you don't spread it too far. Cornelius Vanderbilt said, if I had learned education, I wouldn't have had time to learn anything else. So I know you have a Department of Engineering Education. I don't mean to demean it, but I do think that I wonder how so many of us made it through engineering, a career in engineering without having a course in engineering education. So I'm sure it's helpful, but I've never had their courses, so I don't know how helpful it would be, but some different views. So let me conclude here with a few comments about what I would view as the challenges and opportunities of trying to make people think. As a lecturer, how many of you are thinking about going into an academic career? Yeah, very few hands go up. How many of you think you're actually going to get a position in an academic institution? There's a problem there. And I think this is all over the country. Many of our students look at the faculty and say, I don't want to work that hard. That's too much. And then, of course, the university has changed. I mean, it's not the same university it was in 1972 when I joined the University of Texas. Things change over time. For us old-timers, they have changed for the worse. For you, you won't know what it was before, so it won't bother you. So that's one reason things change, because people don't remember. The collective memory changes with time. So as a lecturer, what's the most important thing, I think? First of all, you have to convince the students that you have command of the subject. It doesn't take them long to figure out you don't know what you're talking about. And if you think you know a topic, and you go into class and somebody asks the most elementary question, why? And all of a sudden you try to think, oh, wait a minute, it's obvious. If you have a linear material that strains very linearly, why? It's very basic, but to us it's second nature. But to a beginning student, well, why it has to be linear? Okay, well, it doesn't have to be linear, then it's no longer linear elastic. Well, what does that mean? So, I think that, they say that a general is trained by 1,000 soldiers or something. A teacher is trained by a lot of students. It takes a long time to get to the point where you can really say, I have command of the subject. And you can probably bluff it for a while, but it won't serve you well in the long run. Presentation and style. I think everybody that teaches is to some extent a performer, and you have to perform to the class. They expect you to put on a show. Some are very good at that. Some are not so good at that. Some people are very good at humor. Others, humor falls flat. So, only thing I could tell you is you have to form your own style. You can't duplicate someone else's. It's not going to work. You can try. You can say, gee, I like the way Meta gave that lecture. I guarantee you're not going to give the lecture the same way Meta gave it. And so it's something that takes time. Interaction. How do you interact with students? We hear a lot about the different methods of teaching that you've got. Some people say, well, you've got to give them a little quiz every time so that they remember it. You've got to have evaluations during the course so that they can give you some feedback and so on. And I'm sure all those things help. I've tried some of those. Sometimes they've been helpful. Sometimes I haven't gotten much out of it. Exams and evaluations. Exams, most people say they hate exams, both taking them and making them up. I always took the approach that I thought they should learn something on an exam. They ought to find some way of putting some things together that they hadn't thought about before. And what I always found was that the good students really liked that. And they would say, that was an interesting exam, I learned something. The others would say, why did you give us that? We didn't have any homework like that. And I said, well, you did the homework. Why should you do it again on an exam? This exam is to force you to think about things in a different way. But that doesn't that doesn't go over very well. For the good students, for the ones who are thinkers, it's great. For others who don't really want to expend the energy, they just look at it as what kind of a teacher are you? Evaluations, I'll talk a little bit more about this, but when I first started, we didn't have evaluations. I always thought you could tell from the students' reactions whether you were reaching them or not. I always found that undergraduate students were much easier to read than graduate students. Undergraduate students, if you've explained something well, they light up. They figured it out, they understand it. Graduate students feel that they don't want to admit that they know or don't know anything because they're supposed to know everything already. And so they're reluctant to even ask questions. I always found that very interesting. You could say, are there any questions? They would come up after class. I said, well, why didn't you ask that in class? Well, I didn't want to. I thought maybe it was a dumb question. So that's one reason that I've always enjoyed teaching undergraduate students, because they're much more like sponges. They soak it up and they let you know when they understand. Graduate students, not quite the same way, but I think over the years you can develop ways of assessing that as well. In an academic career, you also have to serve as an advisor or a mentor. The advisor thing, what kind of advising do you do here for undergraduates? Do you have individuals, or do you have a sort of a bullpen where they just come in and get advice? Both? Well, we used to have individual advisors. When students came into the program, they would be assigned to an advisor. So you would have maybe 10, 15 advisees. And every time they went to register for our courses, they would come by and you'd have to approve it. I found that very useful because actually, many times in the process of this, they would ask some questions. You would say, what are you planning to do? Well, I'm thinking about maybe I'm going to go into environmental. Why? Well, because I like this. And it forced them to have some other conversations. When we went to the system where now you just go in and we're assigned a time to advise, and there's 4 or 5 faculty members there, and as they come in, you may see the same person once in a couple of times in 4 years, but you lose that contact. They don't complain about it because they don't know any other way. But I think we've lost something. We've lost sort of this opportunity to guide people and to give them advice over more than just 5 minutes. The other thing is that they would often come back in between. They'd say, I'm really having trouble with this course. Maybe I should drop it. So, well, if you drop it, you're going to add a year to your undergraduate education. So you could have these kinds of conversations and have an impact on what they were thinking. Also gave a chance to talk about their careers, and every once in a while they would come in with a personal problem. I can't tell you how many times I've had someone come in and say they're going to quit because they broke up with their girlfriend or boyfriend and their life was over and they weren't going to continue in engineering. Or, whatever personal problem was coming up. And I think that, once again, without this sort of, they wouldn't come in just to walk in your office if they hadn't been in there before. And so when you lose that, you lost some of that ability to help them through some tough times. And probably the best thing we could do is tell them, please go over to the student health and talk to someone over there. So one other thing I think that one other role we can serve is to try to help our students and our research colleagues develop judgment. How many times, if you've ever filled out the reference forms or talked to someone, they will ask you, well, does this person have good judgment? It's very hard to define what good judgment is, but it's an ability to, I think, to see what's important. And some people have a much easier time of it than others, but I think it's an essential part of what we can do. And let me just give you one simple example. So we've got the square root of f sub c prime, which is concrete strength, square root of that. It has to be in, you're talking about something in PSI. How many times have you taught a class and they decided to take the square root of 3 instead of 3,000? Judgment, huh? So, first of all, you should understand that the tensile, that this number is going to be a lot less than the number itself. That's the first thing you can learn. But I also went back. When we started, all the engineers had slide rules hanging from their belts. The nerds on the campus. Everybody knew who the engineers were because they had slide rules and pocket protectors. So that was the mark of an engineer. One year our dean gave every faculty member what we thought was a wonderful gift, a pocket protector. So what did the slide rule teach us though? You don't have decimal places on there, right? You had to think about, first of all, if it's 3,000, what were you going to take the square root of? And what did the result give you? Is it a small number or is it a larger number? You had to think about what the magnitude of the number you start with is and what is the magnitude of your answer. So a slide rule forced you to do that. And I think that a lot of times that's now lost because the idea of doing things in your head or making a quick mental note of what should the number be is really beyond most people's thought process. And then we came with the 4-function calculator. I was teaching at Rice University when HP came to the Offshore Technology Conference in Houston. And they bought these to sell, and I think they sold for about $600. And they were sold out. They couldn't bring enough of them in. Of course, it wasn't very long that they had scientific calculators, but it was so novel. Some of you may remember, you can see up at the top, there's little red letters. They had the little red output. And that was considered to be, you know, gee, engineer just had to have that. And they went for it. Then we got the scientific calculators. And we had a huge argument in our faculty. Should students be allowed to bring the calculator to the class? Well, no, they shouldn't. Why? Well, some people didn't have enough money to buy one of these, so that was one. Well, maybe we could buy some more and everybody could have one for the class. Finally, it dawned on everybody that probably wasn't the real reason for giving a test to see how fast they could calculate it. Because I can learn as much from a very simple problem if all they have to do in their head is multiply a couple numbers together. It really doesn't matter whether you have a lot of calculating power. If you have the judgment to see what are the important things in that equation and make an estimate of what the result should be. And that's one of the things that worries me about this next one is now calculators do everything. And so you don't have to think about that. But you also get this. How many papers have you read that have tables with results to 4 significant figures when the concrete strength is 4,000 psi? It doesn't make sense. It's judgment. The judgment to know what is the important part of that calculation. And frankly, I don't care whether it's 63. 60 I'd be just as happy with because I know that this concrete strength isn't that accurate to begin with. So I think all of these require judgment, either from the very simplest to where you have to think about the magnitude of the numbers, to the most complicated where you have to think about what is the importance of the number of decimal places that you're using. So we get to research. Teaching, training, or thinking. To me, it's all of those things. And as research supervisors, we have to do that. I've always been interested in the idea that students come in thinking, I know the answers and they're supposed to find them. Well, that's not why we're doing the research. And you need to make them feel a part of your team. So, teaching experiment versus computation or observation. One of the most important things I learned studying with Meta was the importance of observation. Why did something fail the way it did? What was the reason? What if we did this? How about if we change that? A few years ago, I was at a conference and someone gave a talk about analytical study they had made, and they had used some test results, and they found out that they didn't fit. So in front of this large audience, they said, well, we decided that the experiments were wrong. The next speaker got up and said, I'd like to make a couple of comments about that. And he said, you know, maybe the experiments were wrong, and the results weren't right, but you can't make that assumption ahead of time. You got to figure out why they're wrong, and you've got to explain it. But I think that there is a tendency more and more to rely on the computation and to the exclusion of observation, and you just can't do that. If anything is important, the computer does so many things for you, but it has no judgment. So you've got to have the judgment. You've got to know the variability of results. Nothing makes you a believer of variability until you get a couple of tests and you're sure this way something's going to fail, and it fails in a totally different mode. Interpretation of data. What data do you present? How do you present it? Do you publish it? Where does it go? Implementation. I look at that as something that somebody can use. A lot of people look at that as it's got to be in the code. Well, I don't think everything needs to be in the code. It can still be very, very important contribution. I've had students who have worked on projects, and what we've come up with is that something shouldn't be done some way. Well, this is a negative conclusion. Whole research was a failure. No, it's not. You've learned something about it, and by reporting that, you'll help somebody else understand it in the future. So just because you don't get the results you want doesn't mean that the research wasn't any good. It means you've got to rethink what that's telling you. So let me conclude with what I think success in academia and what some of my largest concerns. Tenure. Who knows best? Well, now we have metrics. Everybody's got to have metrics. What are the metrics? Well, that's very controversial, I think. But what has happened is that in our universities, the decision on tenure has moved away from the faculty involved to the administration, to the upper administration, to the Board of Regents, and I don't know who. They know better than everybody. And as a result, you use metrics. You use student evaluations. So if you get great student evaluations, you must be good. Well, that was somewhat questionable because some people taught only to the evaluation. So we have peer evaluations. You've got to have one of your peers go in and listen, generally a senior faculty member to a junior faculty member, which to me sort of changes the whole dynamic of the class anyway. As soon as you're sitting there, it's not the same as it was before. So those are some of the metrics. Scholarly output. Quality versus quantity. Papers in acceptable journals, reports and presentations. Acceptable journals. They mean referee journals. And generally, they have a definition of that, and they can go to great lengths in deciding what a paper is in an acceptable journal or not. The thing that worries me the most is this quantity. We're stuck now on how many papers someone has written without ever asking the question, were any of them any good? Did anybody ever use this? Was this a valuable contribution? Matt, I think you remember, we used to think we got one good paper out of a PhD. That was pretty good. And now, I see our faculty heading towards every chapter has to be a paper. And you bind it together and that becomes your PhD. And those papers should be published. Well, I don't think we have enough journals for all that. But we've got the solution. We form new journals. And now we have all kinds of new journals all over the world. And we have companies that are making money by putting out journals and charging you $200 to print your paper. Well, I think that that academic institutions have created a monster that they're not going to be able to control. Because if now we had 10 papers was sufficient for tenure, if now we're doing every chapter, maybe 20 papers will be needed. I don't know. But you can always change the hurdle to suit whatever it is you're trying to do. And nobody really looks at quality. I think some people do, but the people making the final decision don't know what the quality is. That's the problem. So I don't know what the solution is, but I do think that it's something that is going to be a problem in academia. Service. We have 3 criteria: teaching, scholarly output, and service. Is it service to the university or service to the profession? A lot of people refuse to serve on university committees because they don't think they get any credit for it. And I have to think maybe they're right. But it is important. It's part of being a group of colleagues. Service to the profession is probably, I would look at it more as being a member of technical committees, contributing to your profession through contributions of your time and your output. So, that brings me to the end of my talk. And I just want to end by letting Meta know how much I've appreciated over the years his friendship. He's been a wonderful colleague. We've done many things together, international conferences, looking around at experiments in labs all over. And so and when I think about it, I've known Meta longer than I've known my wife. It's frightening, isn't it? So, mentor, I've already told you how important he was as a mentor. Teacher and trainer, he was I must say, I never had a course with Meta, but I did TA a course or grade a course with him. But I can't say he was a wonderful trainer. He came down the lab and times when I first started, worked in the lab. We worked on building a slab structure to test. And I remember one time he said, well, this is a big afternoon because the governor of Illinois is coming through and Professor Newmark is coming through. And they came in and I said, Meta, which one is Newmark? So, but most of all, Meta has made me think in many different ways, thinking about a lot of things other than engineering, but certainly thinking about the impact of research and especially the art of observation. And to me, that's been probably the most important thing to my success. So thank you, Meta.
Any questions? Any questions for Dr. Jirsa?
And ultimately, it seemed like the issues that you were bringing up about how the universities are progressing have to do with the lack of connection. I was wondering your thoughts about how that came about and what we can do to reverse that, maybe?
Well, sometimes these things happen so slowly you don't realize they're happening until they've gotten out of hand. I can give you one example of that. Once again, during the time I was a department chair, I went into some old records and I found out that the man who was our dean at the time was a civil engineer, and the letter that went up for his promotion was a very simple letter. It said, so-and-so is doing a great job, This faculty needs him very badly to be promoted, because if we don't, someone else is going to take him. And he was promoted. I'm guessing when I was promoted, there were probably 3 letters. And I don't know what the metrics were. We didn't have to have a cardboard box full of stuff to go up for promotion. Now, it's very complicated. And my question always has been, who reads all that stuff? Who's going to really look at all that to make a decision? I don't think anybody can. But these things keep adding. And if Berkeley is doing it, we better do it. If MIT is doing it, we better do it. And so you get to this point where there's so much of this, it adds on. One of the things I would advise you to do if you do get a teaching job, don't ask people from other schools what they're doing, because they're going to scare you. They're going to say, oh, you got to do this and that. And generally, they'll be wrong, because they very often have the wrong impression. But I think that, and I don't know how we do it, but we've got to get this question of quality. What is the quality? What is the impact of that person's work? Not so much what are the numbers. To me, I really don't care if someone has written 10 papers, but if they've written one paper which is being used and has changed somebody's way of doing things, that's important. And I don't know how we do that, because once it leaves the level of the colleagues and goes up to a higher level, you get farther and farther away from the people who know, and you get more and more reliant on these metrics. And I don't know how to change it. I wish I did, but I think it's something that's going to bite us, and it already is. So I'd like to answer your question, but I don't think many universities would hire me if I had the answer to the question.
Other questions?
I want to thank you very much, Professor Jirsa. I couldn't be more in full agreement with what you have said.
Thank you.
Evaluation. And I had my whole career here at Purdue. And the deterioration of the interaction aspect of the profession is a serious matter, and nobody seems to be dealing with it effectively. I know that my colleague Meta is in full agreement with this. It's just something that, and it's a cultural thing, really. It goes well beyond the university.
Yeah, to some, that's true.
It's an industry.
Yeah. Yeah, but a university is a collection of colleagues.
Yes.
So.
And that has gone away.
And that's what I think is the saddest part.
Thank you. So I'd like to remind you again, there is a reception at Woods Commons following this frankly beautiful presentation. I would like to invite you to thank personally Professor Jirsa and ask him more questions. A couple of disclaimers, by the way, Professor Jirsa. Most of these are graduate students, so I hope they are not upset.
Well, I call them the way I see them.
I agree with you. In fact, most of them have seen experiment reports from the experiment station, SRS reports. They just don't want to admit it. I also want to invite everyone to thank Lou Colarusso and Dan Ryder. They join us from Panther. Panther is the sponsor of the seminar series. You might not be familiar with the name Panther, but you may be familiar with their former name, Erico. They produce Lenton couplers and the device in the construction industry with the coolest name on there, the Rebar Terminator. If you want to know more about it, ask Lou or Dan.
Lou,
Thank you again.
I want to thank you also for putting this together. I keep thinking that the one person who would have much enjoyed being here would have been Bob Smith.
Absolutely.
He could have given a talk that none of the rest of us could have given.
So again, let's thank Professor Jirsa one more.